Hi guys, can you just let me know that you can hear me? Maybe. Oh, awesome. Thank you. So right now you guys are the only ones on here. Addie told me that she couldn't make it, but I know you guys normally have to leave early, and it's 5 o'clock, so we are going to jump right in and get started. I'm going to be going over your assignment for this week, and we're going to be looking at some maybe some things that you're familiar with since you're taking an art history course. We're going to look at some examples of art that will hopefully help to inspire you and help you for your last assignment before you go on your break. And I tried to make this week's assignment not too complicated because my inbox was pretty empty this week, so I'm guessing a lot of you have a lot of finals and midterms and all kinds of crazy things going on right now. So while we do have to keep going in this course, I'm also trying not to just overwhelm you because that is not helpful for anyone either. So I'm going to switch my screen. And let's go over here. Wrong button. And if you can just either chime in or type in the chat box just so I know you can. Oh, Jared and Parker are done with finals. Excellent. That must feel good. If you guys can just let me know if you can see my screen. You should see something that says artist tree right now before I go any farther. Uh-oh, Kaylee doesn't see it. Jared and Parker, can you let me know if you guys see it? Okay, so no, let's try this again then. Everybody's seeing strange things, which is not what we want. Let's try this. All right. Now, okay, Kaylee says now she sees it. Awesome. Okay. Jared and Parker, do you see it now too? Okay, perfect. So what we're going to be doing, I'm going to first explain the assignment a little bit so that you can get some ideas while we're looking at the different artworks. If you haven't been on the site this week, I did also, so this whole presentation I uploaded as a PDF, so you can also go back and kind of look through the images as you want to without having to listen to the whole call again. So just so you know that that is there, so you're not trying to kind of write everything down. So the goal of this assignment is we're kind of starting to wrap up your concentration, which seems kind of wild. So let's do the beginning of January, which hopefully you're feeling comfortable about and not panicked about. And then we're going to be moving into the breadth section. And a lot of people actually find the breadth section to be easier because you don't have to concentrate and carry that one main idea through all the pieces. Instead, the goal of the breadth is to be showing a range of work. So as you're kind of finishing your concentration and trying to push it as far as you can push it and thinking about moving forward, we're going to do a little bit more in-depth research into some artists that might inspire you. And these directions are all written down too, so you don't have to memorize everything that I'm saying. So this is one that I did really quickly. When you go and do yours, you can do it on the computer, you can do it on paper, and you can really make the layout whatever makes sense in your head. I naturally kind of am all over the place, and so that's sort of how this ends up being laid out. There's no right or wrong way to do this. So what you're doing with this artist tree of inspiration is the goal is to get you to look at some artist work that maybe you don't even know exist, or to find some different connections and things that might inspire your work. So how you're going to start it, so Lenore Twani and these pieces are by her. She's someone that's really always inspired my work ever since I started weaving. So you're going to choose one artist, and many of you already have an artist or two that you're interested in and that you look at. So you can start there, or you can choose someone different. It doesn't matter. Once you've chosen that one artist, then you're going to do some research as to who inspired them. And this is where you're going to start to hopefully be introduced to some work that you haven't spent a lot of time looking at before, and seeing some new connections. So, and I really just started Googling like who inspired Lenore Tawney. You could find out, also you could look up people that taught them, and if you get stuck, feel free to email me and I will hopefully stick you. So I searched who inspired Lenore Tawney, and one of the main things that came up was actually that she lived near several other artists. They were all neighbors and they were working at the same time period, so they really inspired each other. So one of her neighbors was Agnes Martin, who she took a lot of inspiration from her work, and this is an image of work by Agnes Martin, which I think you can see the connection, and this was kind of interesting for me because that's someone's work that I haven't looked at before. Another one of her neighbors was Ellsworth Kelly, so I put him up here with an example of his work. Then, to kind of continue this tree, I looked up who inspired Agnes Martin, and as I was researching her, there weren't a lot of other artists or people that she was connected to. Instead, a lot of times she talked about Taoism and Zen Buddhism. So yours may also, you may find things like that still can inspire your work. So I put that down here. And then when I was researching Ellsworth Kelly, Matisse was someone who greatly inspired Ellsworth Kelly. So you're kind of creating this chain of events of people that inspired one another to introduce yourself to some new works of art, because that's a great way just to help broaden what kind of art you're going to create. So before I jump into the examples that we're looking at, does that overall generally make sense? You can just type yes, or if you have a question, you can type your question and I will answer. Kaylee says yes. Okay. And like I said, if you do get stuck somewhere when you're trying to figure out your path, feel free to email me and I'll help you out. So what we're going to look at now, and this is where you're going to start to participate, so I'm not just talking at you, is I went through my giant art history book, and while there are lots and lots of phenomenal works of art to look at, I did predominantly try to pull things that I think relate to the type of work that all of you are creating. So these artists could be kind of your starting point. You may find that they're one of your branches, or if you don't want to use them at all, you don't have to. We're still going to kind of look at them and talk about them and think about how you can learn from them to really finish off your concentration strongly. So this first piece that we're looking at, because a lot of you are doing, we kind of have a group that's doing the Japanese-inspired work happening, and then we have kind of this darker, more fantasy group in this class. So there's a little bit of both. So what I want you to think about as you look at this piece, and these first couple pieces are all from the Romantic time period, is think about, and you can either talk or chat, what emotion do you see in this piece, and how is that emotion being conveyed in the painting? So why don't we start by typing in the chat box? The first part's, I think, pretty easy. And don't, there's really not one right or wrong answer. You may all have different responses. So your first, when you look at this, what emotion do you think of?
Sorry, I just realized my mic was off.
Oh, you were talking.
Yeah, I was like, wait, what? But I think I know a little bit about this
Okay.
painting actually. Isn't it about like supposed to be portraying like sleep paralysis or something, right?
I don't know off the top of my head. I was pulling so many today. Um,
Okay. I believe, yeah, like the
I,
sensation where like people are paralyzed in their sleep and they feel like there's a figure watching them. So I
mhm,
think that that has a certain fear to that for sure. So I think this painting captures, yeah, like a fear, like
mhm.
Haley just typed in.
Yep. So Jared and Parker said gloomy, serious feeling. The expression on the monster's face best reveals this emotion. Definitely, I would say his expression is like really creepy, and you can actually make eye contact with him, which makes it even more disturbing. So Kaylee, the darkness and shadows convey it. Jared and Parker, the emotion is further emphasized in the contrast between the woman and the grotesque monster. Yeah, so those are all things to think
And
um,
that
of how to, again, kind of manipulate what you're doing to maybe get your emotion even more. So we do have this woman who is super, super bright and even clothed in white, which we tend to think of as being peaceful and innocent and pure. And then all of these really dark, disturbing things around her.
and that horse or something in the background, I think that adds to it.
Yeah,
The expression on that horse, like I mean, it isn't like scowling, but it's like has a blank look. Like I don't know, I like it.
right.
Like it
And
looks like I'm not sure if anyone's ever heard of like the game Five Nights at Freddy's, but it reminds me of that.
I have not heard of that game. So here's another one. We have a horse sneaking in again. So what I want you to think of here, one of the drawing issues that you're supposed to be addressing in your work is the illusion of depth. So what are some ways that you think the artist is creating the illusion of depth in this piece?
I think depth. I think it would be I think like the horse and the like if it were just a black background, it would still have depth, but maybe not as much. I think like the horse and the other little spot where there's light and you see something, I think that adds to it mostly.
Right, so they're showing us, especially because we're assuming that the horse has a body, that we just can't see it. So we're assuming that there's even space farther back where we can see nothing, where the horse's body probably is. We have light helps make the monsters recede into space while the woman jumps towards the viewer. Yeah, so one, she's really light, so her brightness is jumping out at us, but even her body positioning is really kind of reaching and draping towards us. Kaylee says it gets brighter when the characters are closer to us and it gets darker even though there is still light as far as it gets further away. Yes. So those are all ideas again. Some of you have already been creating the illusion of depth in your piece, but if you're thinking, oh, that's not something that I've created in a lot of mine, this is one way to do it, and kind of an interesting way because also a lot of it is implied. We're just assuming that there's more back here because we have little tiny hints of something being there. Um, so this piece, again, these couple pieces were all part of Romanticism. So Romanticism was a time where art was shifting from reason towards feeling, and from calculation to intuition, and from objective nature to subjective emotions. So what I want you to think about as you think of those last two pieces and this one that we're looking at here, how do you think the change from reason towards feeling affected work that the romantic artist created? So thinking about that they're really trying to show feeling, how does that change your work, or how does it change the work that the artists are creating? Because they're actually trying really hard to get emotions across as opposed to telling some realistic information or story. This one's stumped everybody, or you're all typing me a long answer. This one is a little bit harder. So what I wanted you to look at and think about, because a lot of you in your subject matter are not dealing with realistic things. You are dealing with the story you're telling us or this emotion that you're creating. And so the artists, as they're working on this, one, they're more free-flowing with their brushstrokes. There aren't really hard, harsh lines. They're using color a lot, so you can see all of these are meant to be kind of there's someone dying, so they're all sort of dark and disturbing, and the colors are helping to tell us that. Here we got a response. I found this artwork to be more abstract compared to the previous works. There is more energy and more dramatic emotion using strong color. Yeah, even this perspective, we get this feeling that he's floating and there's all kind of space down here. So everything about it is not necessarily realistic. The color gets to be what you want the color to be. You get to put things wherever you want to put them. Even looking at the previous two, we have horses showing up in rooms, which is not something we're really normally used to. So as you're working on your pieces, thinking about, so a lot of what I'm trying to get you to think about is where we're showing growth and coming up with different ways of manipulating your compositions, because you're getting near the end, so that can get more and more challenging. So another way is to think about what emotion are you trying to portray in a specific piece, and how can you use color to do that, or how can you use the line quality to do that, or even if you bring some symbolism into your pieces. So this is another kind of wild one that I just wanted to again show you. I don't have a specific question for you. Some we're just going to look at to hopefully inspire you. But this is also another kind of interesting perspective that we're seeing here. So we, as the viewer, know, we get this feeling that this monster or this dragon is really, really large because of the perspective. We kind of feel like we're this tiny little thing down underneath it, as well as we're only getting a back view. So we're left to kind of be curious as to what is on the other side and what he's looking at. And we have this woman that's kind of laying down here but getting swept up and blended into everything. So this piece by Goya. Goya is another artist that if you are kind of looking for dark, creepy, nightmarish, Goya is your place to go. So what I want you to do looking at this piece is describe what you see when you look at it, and then how your eye moves throughout it. So where does your eye first go, and then where does your eye move?
Well, first my eye, for me, my eye goes on like the person that's right there,
Uh-huh.
and then it starts like kind of moving around like more towards the top. Then I like look at the owl or the bat or whatever that is, and
You
just
can
start
start
looking
out
towards
as
the top.
well. And then turn into that. Yeah, and so this is another way of showing depth, because we're losing the detail, things are really overlapping, but also thinking about, so it looks like we're assuming he's asleep or he's trying to hide from all these birds. And at first they're owls, which aren't super scary, but up here then they start to look much more creepy, and the silhouette of the owl starts to look a little bit more like a bat. And then we have this giant cat sitting very patiently back here, not looking like he's going to attack the birds. This is another one by Goya that I actually don't like looking at because I just find it really disturbing, but decided to include it anyway. Um, so this is called Saturn Devouring One of His Children. Um, and so what I want you to think about is actually the mark making. And so when I say mark making, really talking about, Kaylee says, oh goodness, you're all going to have nightmares tonight. They get a little bit more lighthearted as we go through it, so hopefully you...
Nightmare fuel.
Yeah.
I like it.
So when I talk about mark making, we're really talking about, so how is the artist putting the paint or the ink? How is that getting put onto the page? And then how are they using that to actually create a feeling? And then in contrast, thinking about how would this piece be different if it maybe had really harsh outlines or really flat colors?
Well, probably I think having flat colors would kind of take away from it because part of the thing is kind of I'm not sure, it sort of adds to it, like just the overall like the mark making like the it kind of blends, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of smooth, which is different. Like you wouldn't think that it'd be smooth for a guy eating his kid, right? Like like if it were jagged, it would be like sure it would maybe be more intense, but I think this is kind of like a kind of a creative idea
Mm-hmm.
more to stick with that. And as a side note, I think the captions for this picture should be nom nom.
You can also really start to pick up the energy of the artist in the piece. So if you ever, really let yourself loose, it happens a lot more when you're painting. And if you're listening to music, you can really pick up on what kind of music you were listening to if you just let yourself paint and kind of kept switching the types of music that you're listening to. So especially up here in these, all of these lines have kind of these hard directional, you can tell if there were hard edges tend to feel a lot more controlled and restrained, where this is really like we're just getting it down on the paper. Jared and Parker said the dramatic effect of Saturn eating his child won't be as powerful with harsh outlines. Most definitely. The other thing that's kind of interesting, and maybe part of what I don't, well, there's a lot of things I don't like about looking at this because I don't like gory artwork, but is the actual figure of the child, because it just looks like a miniature adult. Because especially for the legs, these proportions and even the muscles are much more adult-like than a child. So even that is portraying that potentially Saturn is really, really large, because this looks like a miniature person.
Yeah, it does.
So this piece actually really reminded me kind of what you're working on, RJ. That it goes back and forth. So this central subject matter is flatter. There is some dimensionality to it, but not a lot. And instead, the dimension and the depth is really portrayed by this haziness over it all. And especially playing with the idea of atmospheric perspective, that as things get farther and farther away, they have much less detail, they fade in color, that it looks like this could go back really, really far. And so, especially for yours, RJ, thus far your pieces have kind of overall been pretty crisp. But you do have kind of the darker sense to some of your characters, that playing with kind of having a fog come in over your pieces could be another way of kind of helping create emotion and story in your piece.
Nice, yeah, for sure. I just took a screenshot of that, and I'm definitely gonna be using this like for a reference. And
Okay. Cool. I think you hopped on after I told them to. Up on the website for this week, this whole presentation is up there as a PDF, so you can download it too and have all these images to look at whenever you want.
Oh, great.
All right, so we're going to switch to a little bit lighter note. And I pulled a couple up because I wanted us to talk a little bit about color. So color is another one of those elements of art that you can really manipulate to do some interesting things. So, one, you can even, we tend to normally work with colors within color theories. So following color theories where we know the colors work together. But at the same time, you can also, if you're planning it and not just doing it because you have no idea what you're doing, you can use color to, again, show an emotion, to manipulate the surface, and to create a feeling. So here, what I want you to think about is how does this color palette impact the image? And if it helps you, you could think about it, what would happen if this image instead was just a black and white image?
I think the color is part of what makes this painting,
Mm-hmm.
because it has a lot of a whole lot of different colors, and it wouldn't like really be as like it wouldn't catch your eye as much as like as if it were like black and white. It would look a little bit like kind of drab almost. I could kind of the way I'm picturing it.
Mm-hmm. Kaylee says that the color makes it pop. Black and white probably wouldn't attract the eye, and it also gives us a different feeling about this woman. So she looks like she's probably eccentric, probably someone that would be really interesting, and it really leaves the world of telling us that this is not exactly a realistic image. Where a black and white image, it potentially could be realistic. So color is also another way to really have fun with the story that you're telling, or to really have fun with taking us to a whole other world. Even sometimes putting colors together that we don't like looking at can affect the viewer. So this is another one that color goes a little bit crazy, and the image is rather flat. Now there are a lot of complementary colors with the blue and orange up against each other. But again, I want you to really think about how these colors affect the work. And then as you're coming to some finishing pieces in your concentration, how could you actually use color differently to manipulate your work? Are any of you having any? And color is not necessarily one thing you have to do. These are just potential ideas. Are any of you having any kind of brainstorms as to things that you could do differently than you've already done with color in the pieces that you're working on?
Well, what I could think of is that maybe to kind of switch it up a little bit, like how that what you told me earlier, the advice you gave me, maybe by adding like a little bit like a fog in the background or something, like a little more hazy look.
Mm-hmm. You could even play with having one of your characters really brightly colored and everything around it fairly dull, since you're, again, you're playing in an imaginary world. Kaylee, I could see you really doing one that sort of like this image that we're looking at right here, where everything is rather flat, but what's making it interesting is all of the pattern and color created in it. Is you playing with something like that. So drawing some more basic kind of outline figure shapes and creating some interesting patterns around them. Jared and Parker said, I believe I should make the nightmare beings in my concentration have obnoxious colors to recreate the frenzy energy of nightmares. I think you could definitely do that. And so that is one of those ways. It's a really interesting manipulation of an element of art, because now you're using the color to help create the feeling that the person in your image is having a nightmare of. That when we're looking at the color, we're like, oh my gosh, this is kind of crazy. The bright colors will exhaust the viewers just as a person remaining in a nightmare. Yes, yes, yes. You should do that. All right. Oh, okay. So I asked the questions before because this next piece takes up the whole thing. So this one I'm guessing you've seen before, and that should say value, which I just noticed I mistyped. So we're gonna see that Jared and Parker have to go. Happy swimming, guys. So we're gonna see that there is not a lot of use of value or rendering of form. So we're gonna look at how Picasso uses a surface to manipulate, as well as how he demonstrates movement. So, because this again, definitely rendering of form, doing value, creating three-dimensional things can be more challenging. And so if you're looking at this, everything is pretty flat. What are some ways that Picasso demonstrates movement in this? Kaylee, can you? Oh, there we go. Yeah, they all seem to be heading in one direction. For the most part, we kind of see that their eyes are mainly looking over in this direction, and then we have this head down here, which is looking up, and we have one head over here that's looking up. But he does use both the way that they're looking as well as the movement of his lines to help create movement all in one direction. Another thing is he's using a lot of overlapping, but in kind of a simple way, and that as things overlap, he's basically just drawing over top of. So normally when we think of overlapping, we have to deal with not showing what's behind it because things aren't see-through. And here we sort of get like, I don't care, and letting things show through, which ends up creating a really interesting pattern in the background. So that's another way to kind of play with overlapping and creating some depth in your pieces, but in a new way of doing so. Let's go to this guy. So in this one, we're looking at some different ways to manipulate compositions. And here you're going to see, and this is back to kind of one of the not so happy images. This composition feels really, really crowded. Almost everywhere you look, there's a figure, and the figures are all on top of each other. So what I want you to say is to answer is, how does this composition make you feel?
Well, I know just like the overall mood that it has, it kind of just chaotic. Both like what it's showing and the colors. I think the colors like are very intense, and there are a lot of people like just like top of each other and spread out, and just like people they fill the canvas and just sort of abstract, but I think chaotic would be like the overall mood.
So depending even on where your story is heading, maybe one of your end pieces, all of your characters come into play, and it would be a chaotic scene if all of your characters and monsters were in one scene and they're all kind of interacting with each other in a different way. Kaylee says it reminds me of stress. Yes, most definitely. So your composition as well, the way that you arrange your composition is another part of your story. And so this is a way where we're not used to really filling up an entire page because it is stressful. It's not necessarily something that we visually love looking at because there's not really a space for our eye to find rest, as well as we feel kind of trapped inside of it, which we tend not to like. But that's something that you can use once in a while if it also works with the message and story that you're telling. This one we looked at a week or two ago when we were looking at abstract expressionist. But again, I wanted you to think of, so he took this woman and really turned her down into really basic, simplified shapes and strange colors. When you see this, what emotion do you think of, and what makes you think of that?
Just gonna say playful, kind of messy. I don't know.
Okay, there's
Kind
no
of,
right along it.
sort, just kind of grunge look to it.
Yeah,
Like around the edges.
it's even sort of childlike.
Childlike. That.
In like the mark makings that are on it, because they're very kind of hurried and big and bold, and there seems like there's really no restraint to it. Keely says, I think of crazy because of all the lines and colors. Yeah, and even the subject matter kind of feels a little bit crazy because it's not really a realistic representation of a person. So in this one, I wanted to give you another idea of showing perspective.
Whoa.
So this is one view of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. And when you think about it, so because the Sistine Chapel is we're looking at the ceiling, the viewer most of the time, they're experiencing this work of art by looking up. So this is what it would look like if you were laying on the floor and staring up at it, which gives you, in a way, it kind of makes me feel dizzy. It makes me feel really small. It looks like a magic eye. Yeah, it does. So this is another way, as you're looking at your pieces, and really playing with what different kinds of perspectives can you give to us. So we're used to getting things and looking at things pretty much at eye level, but how much does it change if instead we're looking straight up at it, if we're down underneath it, or if we're up above it looking down? So those are other ways to bring some interest into a composition. So the next couple I pulled up because we have some concentrations really dealing with still lifes and with food. So what I want you to do is just start naming off, seeing what all you can see in this painting, because there's actually a ton going on in this painting. We have a horse head.
Like the random cow head there.
Yep. So this whole piece is actually filled with a lot of symbolism. Now, to understand all the symbolism, you have to know the history of the culture. But that happens a lot in still life work. So a way to... So we have the concentration that we looked at last week of the food from all over the world. So another way to kind of represent the food and try and make it in a certain place is to think about what other things represent a culture and bring that into the still life. So there are definitely things in this that seem like a weird compilation. We have a little scene going on back here, then there's a man working back here, and we have random hunks of meat hanging everywhere. So what other things can be brought into the work that give us some ideas of where they're from? This is another example of a still life. So this artist, she was a 17th century female artist and was one of the first female artists who really perfected arranging still lifes, and at that point in time they were called breakfast pieces. The point of these and a lot of what was happening in her still lifes were they were showing everyday objects that were supposed to talk about the wealth of whoever was getting this piece. So again, if you're trying to connect work to a certain culture, thinking about what type of things do we represent with that culture. And even if you aren't doing still lifes, you can play with the idea of thinking about how can you bring symbolism into your own work. So like Kaylee, you're doing a lot of kind of Asian-inspired work. You could look up what are some really important symbols and play with how can you bring those into some of your pieces. You could kind of be making up your own still life of a compilation of what type of things you would see in Japanese work or Asian work. RJ, with your characters, maybe you're kind of burying some secret messages within your pieces, or if you're trying to think about what else can you bring into your compositions, thinking about what symbols could go in to make the story even stronger, or just to make us kind of question the meaning behind them.
Huh. Interesting.
So here we
That's a
have,
great idea.
yeah, I think that could get really interesting with some of your characters. Or you could even be thinking, there are definitely a lot of works of art that artists kind of paint themselves into. So you could even think of, are there certain things that are really meaningful to you? And how can you work them into your pieces that we wouldn't necessarily know, oh, this represents RJ, but it's just another way to help give you ideas as to what can you be putting in the pieces to tell more of your story. So in this one, we're seeing a whole lot of repetition. So we have all these peaks that are repeating, as well as all of the lines that are creating the peaks that are repeating. So what I want you to think about is how does repetition actually help this composition? So what is repetition doing to this composition?
Adding depth, I think.
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. So, and part of that is also it almost happens naturally because they're overlapping. And whenever something's overlapping, then we start to feel depth. We also get the depth because some of them are darker than others. But this is so Kaylee, I could see you have the one drawing of the mountains with some trees and it's kind of foggy, but I think it needs a little bit more of potentially taking ideas from this and bringing more repetition of the mountains or more repetition of the trees into that piece, as well as this piece kind of reminds me of that piece. So thinking about visual balance. And so part of what we're seeing here is up in the front, right, there's a lot more weight. So it's a lot heavier because the things are really detailed. We have these heavy rocks. And going into the background, we can hardly see anything. But what helps to actually balance this piece out, well, before I tell you, I'll ask you. Knowing that this front part visually is much heavier than this back part, but for the most, we like balance in compositions. What helps to balance the weight out of this heavy part with this empty back part? Do you have any idea?
The balance of, like, if it were all detail, maybe I may not know where to go, but there's a point that stands out because of the fog, I think.
Right, so we need this empty space because it kind of helps stand this out. The other thing that helps to balance the weight of this being really light is we kind of get the feeling that there's really, really great depth here and it goes back super, super far, which in turn balances out this heavy front part. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Everybody says yes. Poor Kaylee and RJ, you guys have to talk a lot tonight. However, since you guys are on and answering all my questions, you just have the one assignment. People that are not on are going to have to write written responses to all this. So you're getting your homework done.
Nice.
So I know that feels good. So this is an example, again, it's rather flat. So what I want you to think about, if we took any one element out of this, would it be incomplete? So how would it feel if we removed this figure? Or how would it feel if we removed this figure? Thinking about how these pieces are kind of interacting with each other. Okay, so Kaylee says it would feel unbalanced. Most definitely it would. We would have too much kind of empty space, as well as, so this big like peacock skirt that's overlapping this figure helps this figure to no longer seem like they're floating. If this skirt was not here, this figure would be floating because their legs most definitely are not long enough to go down here, and there's really nothing to imply a ground. So this overlapping just makes us think, oh, maybe something's back there, but we don't see the feet, so it doesn't even matter. So this is a way, again, if you're not really into shading, that all of this is simply line and shape. And so this shape is more colored in than these shapes. But overall, the composition is still really interesting. We're still getting depth happening. So this is a fun way to play with pattern and shape making. So this, I think, could be something fun for you to play with as well, Kaylee. This one I pulled up, I spelled composition wrong, just because of the different formatting. So we're normally really used to creating compositions in rectangles and in squares, but here we have a composition in a circle, which most of the time I would tell you to stay away from a circle. But what I want you to think about is, why is this piece actually working? So why does this composition work in a circular format? Okay, so Kaylee says it looks like he is trapped inside of it. Yeah, so it's partly because they really fit the figure into this space. So he's right up against the edges. It also kind of made life potentially easier for the artist, because in a rectangular format, which is what we're used to, there would be all this other space that they have to deal with. But by creating this little frame that we're looking into, they don't have to deal with all the extra space, as well as it is sending a different message, because this person looks kind of sad and depressed, but they also do really look like now like they're trapped inside of this space. This is another really flat image. What I want you to discuss, and you can even disagree with me if you want to. So I think this is an overall flat image, but at the same time, as you keep looking at it, it's almost like one of those optical illusions. It goes back between looking like it's flat and then looking like it's showing depth. So what things are happening in this composition that's making that playfulness take place?
I think the wall in the back has a lot to do with it. The wall is like kind of angled out, like how it would be with the depth, but it doesn't not quite, like it's still a little bit flat. Same thing for the tables. I think the tables are they're one, like the second one in the row is kind of flat, but the first one is closer, and that adds the depth to it, so it looks like she's somewhere in between the two.
Yeah, so it's definitely, so really the artist dealt with a little bit of dimension, three-dimensionality, in drawing these tables. What kind of plays with our eye is, so we have these lines, these black lines, that are going to a vanishing point. So he's using 1-point perspective, which is starting to create depth, but then it gets a little bit funny because this whole line that should come down and split the composition, then we have this totally flat field of black, which makes this wall like just turn into part of the floor. But that's another interesting way of manipulating your composition and manipulating space. It's also kind of a creative way if you aren't super comfortable with drawing things, a lot of things three-dimensionally. They took this really simplicity, put detail onto the tables, and the items on the table look three-dimensional. This woman right here is very, very flat. She just starts to have a little bit of shape to her because of everything that she's up against. So I'm going to jump back to the beginning because I think both of you popped on after I explained this part, and then we're done. So this assignment you do have to do, but you don't have to answer all these questions because you just did. So the goal of the assignment this week is to, one, give you some last inspiration as you work on finishing your concentration, because that is due the beginning of January when we come back from our break, as well as because we're heading into the breadth, and the breadth part requires kind of all kinds of inspiration. So the goal of this is to get you looking at some new works of art. So what you're going to be doing is creating what I'm calling an artist tree. You can make it on the computer if you prefer making it on paper and scanning it or photographing it. That's totally fine, as well as however you want to lay it out is fine. I laid it out like this because this makes sense to my brain. The ultimate goal of this is it needs to make sense to you. So don't worry about how it comes across to me as long as it makes sense to you. So here's what you're going to do. You're choosing one artist to start with that you find their work interesting in some way. So I started with Lenore Tawney, and then this is an example of her work. And then you're kind of going down this rabbit hole of inspiration. And the goal of going down this rabbit hole is to potentially uncover some other artists that have things that would be of interest to you that otherwise you wouldn't find. So what I did is I started with Lenore Tawney, and then I just Googled who did Lenore Tawney learn from, or who was she inspired by. And one thing that I found is that several of her neighbors were also artists. So she worked a lot with them and learned a lot from them. So one of her neighbors was Agnes Martin. And so this is an example of her work, which I hadn't actually seen before, but I really like. So I included her in kind of my artist tree of inspiration. Another one of her neighbors was Ellsworth Kelly, who I am familiar with his work, but haven't really thought about it a lot in relationship to mine. So it's also taking work that you may be familiar with, but looking at it in a different way. So I included that in here. Then I went and I researched who inspired Agnes Martin. Which there were not a lot of people that were actually mentioned, but a lot of times she talked about Taoism and Zen Buddhism. So you may have things that aren't specific people, because I could pull inspiration if I did more research into these two cultures and religions. And then Ellsworth Kelly was really inspired by Matisse. So I put Matisse up here. So what I'm asking is that you have at least 5 branches, and so each one of these things is considered a branch. You can go much farther if you're kind of into it. And the goal, like I said, is just to get you looking at some new work and potentially finding some new connections and new inspiration for your work. You are welcome to pull someone from the list of artists that we looked at today. This whole presentation is a PDF on this week's website, so you can just download it and don't have to like listen to the recording over and over again. But you don't have to use someone from that list. If you have another artist that you want to start with, that's totally fine. If you really get stuck in your searching of who they're inspired by, just shoot me an email. But for the most part, if you go into Google, and I really was just Googling questions like who inspired this person, you could look up who they actually learned from. So a lot of times it'll tell you their church. Do you have any questions about that? Good?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
We're sorry
Well,
for that delay if somebody was here. Okay.
oh, that's okay. Well, thank you too for hanging out with me this evening. So, what you have this week, if you haven't already, you have your illuminated manuscript. You get to continue working on your concentration, and then you have this artistry. And then we have a nice big break. Over the break, I will be kind of checking in with all of you on what you still owe me. And you'll also see up on the site, we're going to do, just like we did at the very beginning, I'm going to do one-on-one calls with all of you to really dive in about your concentration. So you can hop on there and pick a date that you want to do that. All right. Let's see.
That sounds great.
Cool. Kaylee says, would you be able to email me the link to the main page of the site? The link you sent me works, but I still yes, Kaylee, I will do that as soon as I get off this call for you. And we will get you rocking and rolling. All right. Have a wonderful, well, actually, it's a while till I will see you all again. So have a good week. Have a good break. And I look forward to seeing all your work.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Have great holidays.
You too. Bye.
Happy holidays, everyone.